Blur category. Hi guys, we still have some blur filters left. And let's look at them. Those blur filters, which we'll consider today, appeared in Photoshop quite a long time ago. And they are in a category called blur. That is, the blur gallery contains later filters. And just the blur category contains the filters that have been around for a long time, but some of them still relevant. Let's start with radial blur. To begin with, I'll create a copy of the layer of this image. So, filter, blur, radial blur. And let's see how it works. Here, let's assume in the initial state it looks like this. It has a zoom and spin option. Let's first consider the spin. The greater the number and the thicker these lines are, which show the operation of the filter, the greater the impact of the filter will be. And so, for example, this is the result if you choose spin. As an exercise, we'll use another option, which is called linear. Here, in the same way, the thicker the location of these lines, the greater the impact of the filter. And we can move the center, for example. We can move it to the top, for example, like this. And we can reduce the blur itself. Let's say I make it like this. Click OK. And that's what I got. And now, in order to create the effect of movement in this car, I just apply a mask. Take a black brush and erase the effect of the filter on the mask where it shouldn't be. As a result, we got a very realistic effect of fast driving. For example, that's what we had in the beginning. It is a car that stands still. And now we have this picture with movement effect. The next interesting filter is called the surface blur. Unlike the unusual Gaussian blur, not all the pixels in a row are blurred, but pixels on a certain plane that is filled with some color. And the borders remain more or less clear, which makes very convenient to use this filter to remove noise in photos. And it can also be useful in retouching. Let's try it. I'm making a copy of the layer. You can also use a smart filter if you want. Then filter, blur and select the surface blur. And look, when I increase the radius, the blur increases. But at the same time I keep clear lines. The lips are visible, the eyes are visible, the eyebrows are visible, and it doesn't get such a complete feeling of fog, as for example it occurs with other types of blurring. The lower the threshold, the clearer these boundaries are, and the higher it is, the more blurred the borders become, and the action of the filter becomes similar to the action of the Gaussian blur filter. Well, let's pick up some reasonable values. This is the threshold I will set, and reduce the value of the radius. That's it. Of course, some defects of the face are smoothed out, but the face occurs some plasticity and blurring. But it can be handled. This method will suit you if you need to do such a quick retouch, not very pretentious, but with a good effect. Adding a layer mask. We take a black brush and remove the filter action, where it shouldn't be, reducing the opacity to emphasize a little skin texture. Okay, well, I think it can be done like this. Look what we had. The skin was like this, and now it looks like this. And now our task is to remove the filter action, for example, from the eyes, or from the hair, because, well, obviously it shouldn't be there, and maybe you can remove it from the lips. The brush can be done more transparent. Somewhere leave its opacity at 100%. Well, that's up to you. And so, let's compare. This is quite a decent result, considering the ratio, time, quality. And we are moving on. A more advanced version of this filter is called Smart Blur. Let's see how we can remove the noise with this blur. A copy of the layer is being created. Well, let's make a Gaussian blur in order to understand the difference. Blur, Gaussian blur. For example, if we want Gaussian blur, then we'll get this effect, the overlay of frosted glass. If we zoom in on this image, we'll see that the noise level on it is quite high. That is, these are the colored dots that we see. They are just called noise. And this is due to the fact that the shooting was done with very low quality camera, let's say. I want to remove this noise by blurring, but as you understand, with the help of a standard Gaussian blur, nothing good happens. We still need to preserve the paths of the image and not get a fog. Let's try to do it. Filter, blur, smart blur. We select manual mode, and just like in the previous case, we choose the radius and threshold. The tool works more subtly here, and even now, when we zoom in, we can see that our dots have become much smaller. Let's click OK. That's it. Of course, this is not exactly the effect that we would like to get in the end, but still, if we go back to the source, we can see that the noise was most visible in the sky. Due to the fact that there are ripples on the sea, the noise is not so noticeable. Of course, this picture is far from ideal, but still we managed to improve it a little, and let's improve it a little more. And at the same time, just remember the adjustment layers. I'll apply curves and just move these sliders here, in this way. It is a very uncomplicated correction in fact. Let's remember what we had in the beginning. Look at the amount of noise we had, and see what we got. As a result, the picture became much cleaner. The next filter is a lens blur filter, which allow you to create an imitation of shooting with different depth of field. In order to demonstrate the effect of this filter, I will create a mask on a copy of the layer, and now you'll understand why. I will fill it with a gradient. Well, like this, from black to white. Then go to the filter, blur, and select the lens blur. So I got this picture, because I didn't switch to the layer and work directly with the mask. Therefore, I'll now cancel. I activate an image with the layer, make the layer icon active, and apply a lens blur. And that's what we got. It's quite an expected result, since we have a mask applied. By the way, the source is a mask layer, pay attention. But the trick here is that we can change the focal distance. Look, I'm moving the slider, and the blur zone is shifting. I can arrange it in some other way. You can even move it completely, but let's leave it like this. The radius allows us to edit or reduce blur. Here you can make it stronger. Well, I won't increase it so much, and I will click OK, and this is the result we have. Here is what we had, and what we have now. In general, the same result could be achieved with filters from the blur gallery group, namely with the displace filter. But, as you know, in Photoshop, every action can practically be done in several ways, and you choose what is more convenient for you. And we are moving on. In principle, we have already reviewed all the main filters that may be useful to you. There are still a few filters which application is not so obvious, but still, I will say a few words about them. Let's start with a filter called box blur. Look, if we apply Gaussian blur, then the whole image is uniformly blurred. Well, somehow it is more convenient to compare it with Gaussian. Something like this. Let's apply a box blur. The difference is that the Gaussian blur becomes less active on vertical and horizontal lines, creating such a peculiar effect. That's what we get. Probably, if you use imagination, it can be used somehow. Next, blur filters. We have filters like blur and blur more. Well, in fact, they are practically useless. Now, if I choose blur, then it is very small. And you won't even see it, although it is there. If you apply the blur more, then it becomes a little more blurry, but it is still invisible to our eye. The next type is average. In this case, it turns out just the average color of the entire image. For example, if we take another picture, for example, this one, filters blur average, then we'll get a different color. But in this case, we have a layer with a mask. It has some opacity, but nevertheless, we got some color. Thus, we can just get some average color of our image. And let's see what else we have left. And we still have a filter called shape blur. It is implied that when we choose some shape from the shapes, which we can also create ourselves, then the blur will occur on these shapes. For example, if I choose a heart, then somehow its shape will be taken into account when blurring. Or I choose, for example, such a shape, then the shape also changes somehow. And if this is applied to the entire image as a whole, then in general nothing is visible. To be honest, despite all my efforts, I haven't been able to find any reasonable examples of using this filter. If you have any interesting ideas in this regard, I will be glad if you share them with me. The principle of operation of this filter, as I said, is to use shapes when blurring. And maybe someday you'll be able to apply it. We can give many more examples of usage of blur filters, but then our course will become completely endless. So let's move on to the homework. We are going to have several assignments today. The first is to create a motion effect on this image. The second homework task will be such a simple retouching with the surface blur. Then we'll take images of the sea as the third task and apply smart blur to it. Well, the fourth task will be to use the lens blur. Thus, as an exercise, you use only the most interesting filters from this category. The rest of the filters you just take note of. Try to apply them on your images. And it's all for today. It was Peter Romanov and AIM School. See you next time.